Hi and welcome. I'm Mirtha Donistorg. I cover Black and minority-owned businesses for the AJC, and I'm also part of Unapologetically ATL. So first, thank you for subscribing to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Your support makes everything we do possible. In addition to the great journalism we provide you every day, we offer you live events like today's conversation. These bring you inside the newsroom to meet our reporters and go deeper on some of our biggest stories and topics. Before we get into it, some housekeeping. Today's briefing runs for 45 minutes. We'll take your questions later in the session. Please use the Q&A function on the right sidebar. It's a question mark inside a circle. You can add your questions and vote for someone else's questions if it's something you want to know as well, and we'll get to them at the end. But this is a very special story for Unapologetically ATL, as one of our members, Nedra Rhone, traveled across the South with her daughter, her little mini-me, on a quest to explore Black history and how it's being preserved and depicted in the South. It was really a heartwarming and enlightening series, and I'm really excited that we get to dive further into it. So here's Najja Parker and Nedra Rhone.
Thank you, Mirtha. I really appreciate it. I'm so excited to get this conversation started about Nedra's beautiful trip across the South to visit so many Black history museums. I want to start off by introducing our distinguished guest for today. First, we have Jeff Bruce. He is the Director of Exhibitions at Tubman Museum in Macon. We also have Jessica Fairley. She is the director at the Africatown Heritage House Museum in Mobile. We also have Vedette Coleman Robinson. She's the executive director of the Association of African American Museums. And last and certainly not least, we have Nedra Rhone, who is the AJC's lifestyle columnist and UATL curator. I would love to have Nedra kick us off and tell us more about your journey in the South with your daughter, Layla. Tell us why you began this journey and what your purpose was for yourself and for your daughter and the readers as well.
Thanks, Najja, and thank you all for joining us today. I am very happy to have some of the people that we talked to on the trip here today, because it was such a special trip for us. We decided to do this story because there were two new museums opening that are based on African American history. One is Africatown Heritage House, that is in Mobile, Alabama, and the other was the International African American Museum in Charleston. So bookending those two museums, in between, we just decided that we would travel to 3 others. So it was a week-long journey to 5 different museums. My goal was to expose my daughter to the kind of history that wasn't always accessible to me when I was growing up. There was one museum where I was growing up, and that's the only museum I went to when I was a child. So I wanted her to see the breadth of information out there. The other thing really was, for me personally, I wanted to explore a little bit more about what's happening in the world. I feel like we're facing some very interesting issues with regard to history, the way it's taught, the way we learn, and I wanted to just try to understand a little bit more about that. So for readers, my hope was that people would be inspired, that they might take their own journey with their own mini-me's, or even with friends, to reach beyond the confines of whatever state they happen to be in, and just to see more about the way that Black history is represented in different institutions.
We're going to get into all of the details about Nedra's trip, but before we get deeply into the conversation, I want to start by asking our panelists about their very first visit to a Black History museum. Can you remember where you were, what your first impression was of the museum, and why you even visited? But Dad, I'd love to start with you.
Oh gosh. First and foremost, thank you all for inviting me. My first trip to an African American museum was actually the Bettis Academy Museum, which is part of my family's heritage. So I just grew up in African American history and culture. And then the next one would be the African American Museum in Philadelphia. I didn't grow up too far from Philadelphia, in New Jersey. So we, would truck across the bridge to go to Philly to check out that museum. And it was always such an amazing time to just be able to connect with legacies of African American history and culture, and just learn a little bit more about who and what we are that wasn't being taught in the classroom.
I'm actually going on a trip with my dad to Philadelphia this summer, so that will absolutely be a part of our journey.
Yes, please.
Jessica, would you like to would you like to go next, Jessica?
Sure. One of the first that I can remember going to was the Slave Haven in Memphis. I went there in my early 20s, just visiting a friend in the Memphis area. And what I saw there, I didn't receive when I was coming up here in Mobile. There aren't any Black museums, or there weren't before the Africatown Heritage House that I knew of. So when I went to Slave Haven and learned, how it was a part of the Underground Railroad, and even just going down into the area where slaves, if your head can fit through something this large, then your body can fit through. Just seeing that dynamic, of what they had to go through, it was something striking that stuck with me for the rest of my life. And then the next museum that I went to was the Civil Rights Museum there in Nashville as well. And I'm sure, probably the majority of us have been there and kind of learned that history. And that's really what we learn in elementary school is, what they teach, or what I learned in elementary school is what they teach inside of the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. But, just knowing that there are so many others now, and even learning from Nedra just recently, as a few minutes ago, how many Black museums that are out there. I have my work ahead of me.
I'm so glad that you mentioned Memphis. That is originally where I'm from. That is my hometown. And that's actually one of my first visits to a museum was the Civil Rights Museum there, as well as visiting the underground journeys in Memphis as well. I have a better appreciation for it now as an adult, but when I was 8 and 9 years old going to the same field trip every February, it was a little exhausting. Jeff, would you like to go next?
Sure. The first museum experience that I actually remember, or that kind of stuck with me, was actually Hampton University. As part of our freshman orientation, we went to the University Museum and actually sat down, and the curators talked to us and brought objects and artifacts out and talked to us about it. And I remember really enjoying that. I had not really thought about museums that much, and basically outside of that first experience, I really didn't go back probably until senior year. And then I just remembered passing over campus one day, hey, I remember this museum, it was really cool. And I went inside again, and I started going throughout my senior year, and that's when I really got a taste of that institution's collections, which has really great early 20th century and late 19th century African art collection and Harlem Renaissance African American art collection. So that was really my introduction to museums and to the worlds of African American art and history. And it's kind of stuck with me and guided me from there on.
And then I'll toss it to you, Nedra. I want to hear about yours too.
Yeah, also what Jeff didn't mention is, if I'm not mistaken, Hampton University Museum was the first African American museum, I believe. So my memory is of the museum that was in Chicago. I mentioned this briefly. It's DuSable Museum. It was founded by Dr. Margaret Burroughs, and that was the only place that I really knew where we could go to learn about Black history specifically. Obviously, there were other avenues where I, got that information, but that was the only museum that I knew of. And I actually ended up, when I was in my early 20s, they had started doing travel groups with the museum. And so Dr. Burroughs was escorting people to Africa. And that is when I took my first trip to Africa through DuSable Museum. So they did a lot.
Okay, now let's kick off the conversation even deeper. Unapologetically, ATL recently polled its readers to find out if they've ever taken a trip specifically for a Black History museum, and about 75% of our readers said yes. So I would love to ask our directors, what have you learned about the visitors who come to your museum, and what have you learned about why they visit? Jeff, you want to kick us off?
Okay. So I would say that what I've learned here is that, well, two things really. We're in Macon, which is not that far from Atlanta, and I came here from Virginia, and I just assumed that being so close to Atlanta, that there would be all these opportunities for African American artists and all these opportunities for learning, all of that wonderful, incredible history, and that everybody just knew everything, right? And everybody was just, a scholar. And it turned out that that was not the case. And what I found out was people really want, at least in this community, really want to have their stories told, right? Local stories, regional stories, stories about this place. And so that's what we've done. So what we've done is we try and talk about national trends, national events, national history. And we do that through telling local stories about how people in this community dealt with those issues or were affected by, influenced, impacted by those issues and events. So we've kind of learned that everything to an extent is local. These trends, these events, these happenings, this politics, this all of it affects people in the community where you live. And if you start there, you can work your way out into all sorts of issues and topics and philosophies, and it all becomes relevant to the community where you live. So what I've learned is that politics is local and everything else is local too. And so that's how we've approached the stories that we tell at our institution.
Jessica and Badette, what would you add to that?
I would add that the Black experience looks different for people from every walk of life. I get a lot of young people who come in and they have come in the door with no interest. They leave wanting to know more. They leave wanting to learn. They leave wanting to explore their history. And to me, that's the most important part, because once you have an awakening, once you begin to want to know more, then you can begin to learn more. And not only that, you can begin to teach more, and you can begin to pass it on from generation to generation. What a lot of people don't know the story of the survivors of the Clotilda, the last known slave ship to come into America. There were 110 survivors who came over on that ship and built a community here in this area. So a lot of people come in not knowing that, and a lot of people leave wanting to know more about who these people are. But not only that, who are their people? Where is their ship? Who was their great grandparents? Am I in some way connected to the Clotilda? I think that's what I'm seeing a lot of people get out of it. And then I'm learning between different races, what's important to some may not be important to others. There's this debate here of whether the ship should be raised. I know the Alabama Historical Commission is kind of working out whether that's something that can even be done. But what I see in the Black community is that the Black community is less concerned about whether the ship should be raised. They are more concerned about telling the story of the people of the Africatown community and what they were able to do once they got here. So that's what I'm seeing coming out of the visitors who come into the Africatown Heritage House.
And Badette, what have you learned?
So being the executive director of the Association of African American Museums, we are supporting all of the museums, all of the African American focused museums throughout the country. And what I've seen is exactly what Jeff mentioned, and is exactly what Jessica mentioned. All of our museums start in community first. We are one of the only organizations where across the board, our members start in the communities that they are going to serve first. So the collections are coming from the communities, the stories are coming from the communities. When you can't collect artifacts. You are collecting the stories of the individuals within the community, and we serve the community writ large. So what does that look like? That looks like, rapid response messages and rapid response programmings when things are happening to African Americans. So what we wind up seeing is, since inception of our museums and even now, folks in the communities are doing this thing where our museums are sacred places. They want to learn about their history, but they also want to be connected to it because their grandparents may be in there. I have a wonderful story that I shared with Nedra, and she was like, yes, 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 I love it. We have a museum that's part of our membership where there was a young woman who was sitting in the visitor center. That is her job. She's in the visitor center. She just happened on break to walk around the museum, and she found her family in the museum, commemorated in wall text. And she just cried because she didn't know a lot of the history, but also she didn't know that they were there. And then this is what our museums do. This is why that pilgrimage to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture became so important to so many people, because we wanted to feel connected. And that museum is actually doing exactly what all of our museums do, which is making sure that they are part of the community. So that's what I'm seeing. When you ask the question of why do I see, or why are people going to museums? It's twofold. They want to be connected to something, but they also want to learn things that, maybe they're not learning K through 12 or even in college, and Jeff said something that was, his story is so important because he's talking about the breadth of his time at Hampton University. He was there as a freshman, and it wasn't until his senior year. He probably passed that museum 5,000 times going to class. And here it was, his senior year, he's being reintroduced to the museum through new eyes. And that museum, as Nedra said, is the oldest in the country. It's over 150 years old, and it's one of our oldest museums. So, that's really what we're seeing. We're seeing this connectivity and people really wanting to be part of things.
Can I add? Can I add one thing?
Sure, go ahead.
So the other thing I forgot to say that I was thinking of, but I forgot to say, is that a lot of times the visitors are like first-time museum visitors. Like the first museum that I went to, was this museum on the campus of this HBCU. And so for a lot of people, the first museum they go to is, this African American museum. And so there is this, one of the things that we try to do or have learned to try to do is, present stories, obviously, but also to try and, raise consciousness a little bit about what museums are, about what this museum is, and the services that the museum can actually provide.
But Dad, I also love what you've said about community and how people come together to find out new information and just to be amongst people who have like interests. We know that museums face a lot of barriers in terms of staying open, maintaining them, and making sure people have access to this history. Can you all expound on some of the barriers that museums face? Jessica, can you start? Because I think Africatown has an especially special story.
I think one of the most recent or current things that we're facing is them trying to take education of Black history out of schools in this area. So we are right next door to Florida, and we get Florida students who are going to be coming on field trips to the Africatown Heritage House. We teach Black history, and we also teach it authentically. We are telling the authentic story of people who were smuggled over to America and taken away from their homes. We don't sugarcoat anything. We keep it tactful. But this is something that the Florida school districts have been taking out of their education classes. So one of the things that's been started in Africatown is something called Teach Africatown. Teach Africatown is a program that local professors got together on, and they're teaching professors and teachers around the country, how do we teach this hard history? How do we teach this to students and kind of skirt around and work within the parameters of what the states are giving us in this area, being that they're trying to take it out of the classroom? homes. So that's one of the biggest challenges that we're facing inside of our museum, is just that making sure we are able to continue to tell this story, and teachers are able to continue to tell this story, even so begin to tell this story, because honestly, a lot of people in Mobile grew up here and didn't even know about the Plateau Africatown story. So that's what we're facing right now. There's also a lot of work to be done in the community. We face equity issues every day. We face environmental issues every day, health issues every day. So there's a number of groups that are working in the community who are tied to the museum, and they're hoping that this museum sparks an economic revival in this area. So there are a lot of things that are kind of working, to be rebuilt in the area. And I can see that being the case for not just this Black neighborhood down here, but also Black neighborhoods across the country that have befallen on hard times over the years.
Najja, I wanted to mention that because what Jessica said, I think, is really relevant to what my daughter's experience was when we were on the trip. And one of the most profound things that I recall her seeing was this idea that what we were seeing in these museums, she believed to be true. She knew to be true because these were stories that she was hearing firsthand from the people who experienced it. And she was able to draw connections between what's happening in the larger world and the ways in which history is being reshaped, reformed, retold, rewritten, whatever you want to call it. And an understanding that I might have an opinion about something and someone else may have an opinion, but we both have to be working from a place of truth. And to hear her, at 12 years old, sort of come to that was very, it was surprising, but it was also very exciting for me, because I think that that's really what a lot of these museums are going to end up serving as these resources for truth.
Nedra, one of my favorite parts about your entire package was having your daughter's words and her impressions of the museum included and captured. She kept a journal throughout this road trip to talk about her experience. Was there anything in her journal entries that surprised you or made you particularly proud of?
But that was one, the big one. But there was also, I felt her ability to process a lot of what she was seeing at these different places was surprising. I don't think I was doing that when I was 12. And I also think that she was able to make connections because all the institutions that we went to were very different. As Jeff has said, it's very community oriented. Africatown is very specific to the story that's in Africatown, but she was able to draw those connections that we've been talking about to the larger culture and the broader experience of African Americans. And I thought that was also something I was very excited about, because that's kind of what I wanted. I wanted her to do that. And I was doing it myself, honestly, because I don't know that I've always done that either.
I want to go back to this conversation about educating our children in the midst of all this controversy around critical race theory. Just a few days ago, Vice President Kamala Harris, she decided to turn down this invitation to debate with DeSantis about the changes in the education system. What can we do to reclaim how we educate our kids about our Black history? Vedette, you want to start us off?
Sure. So what I see in our museums is just a resiliency. There's a resiliency, a tenacity, and a buoyancy for us to just continue to do the things that we've been doing. I look at, this is not the first time that people have been trying to sanction us and make us quiet and, just stay in your place. Do not talk about African American history and culture. And it just does not work, because we have a mission to do that. We have a mission to make sure that people know our history. We have a mission to make sure that people understand the trials and tribulations that we went through are part of America's history. And, it may be done in covert ways so that people can keep their jobs. But truthfully, we've been doing this work since, the Black Power movement. And this is just a secular thing. And I don't mean to sound flippant, but when I speak to my members, they just say, we're just going to keep on keeping on. We have a mission, we have these museums, and we have this knowledge, and we're going to make sure that it's done. So that usually makes me really happy, because I know that they're up against so much. And they just continue to keep on keeping on.
Jeff, what would you add to that conversation or that topic about educating our children authentically?
Our mission is very clear, and it has not changed or been impacted or influenced or affected by anybody's inability to understand or deal with critical race theory. We still tell the stories that need to be told. We still talk about the issues that need to be talked about. There has never been any conversation or any intimation that anything that we do should be stopped or toned down or changed in any way to make it more palatable to this group or that group. So we are doing what we have always done, and that work is our contribution to that ongoing discussion.
And we are about to pivot to Q&A from our audience members. So if you do have questions, please don't forget to drop them in the chat. But before we get there, I want to ask everybody, what can we do individually and collectively to better support our museums?
I'll take that real quick. My favorite thing to say is donate and visit. And if you can't visit, donate. A lot of people think that when you're talking about donations, I don't have $100 a month to give to a museum, but sometimes, I have a woman who gives $1 to AAAM every month. I had a member who told me almost the same exact thing. She had a woman who was donating $1 a month to her organization. It's just whatever you can give to make sure that museum stays relevant and stays in the eyes of everyone. The other thing that's really easy to do that folks forget, in this day and age with everything being on your fingertips, just share on social media somebody's program, an organization's program, even if you didn't go. Just to make sure that their information still is circulating, and that helps out tremendously. It's unbelievable the power of the fingers on your phones, just to raise the elevation of everyone. So that's what I say. If you can't go, donate. And I know that Jeff and Jessica can relate. So I speak for you as members or about to be members. Donate if you can't go. It's really just the thing that keeps everybody sustained.
Yeah, a big part of my desire with this story was to encourage people to take those trips. I think, as Jeff said, he was, at Hampton for all this time and went past the museum. I've lived in Atlanta for 17 years now, and I had never been to the Tubman Museum in Macon. So I just feel like, whether it's lack of knowledge or, just because it's not immediately accessible or immediate on people's minds, we don't necessarily make those trips to these places. And they're so close. It's so easy. And I feel like we could do a lot more of that. I personally am going to continue doing this, even though I did this for a project. I do want to keep visiting museums, Black museums specifically, in different states and seeing what they have to offer.
I tell people all the time when they come to the museum, I tell them, when you walk through these galleries, like 90% of what you see came from people like you. These artifacts were donated. These works of art came from private collections. This institution depends on and lives through the generosity of the people that support it.
And Jessica, I want to toss it to you just in case you have something extra to add.
No, nothing extra. They said it all. Yes, donate, give, and donate to the communities as well, because I don't know about a lot of Black museums, but I'm sure they are working in partnership with the Black community. And I know that the community that I am in need help just as much as the museum does. So if you can also donate to the communities, that will be beneficial as well.
I just have one more point. And I'm trying to make, so the other thing that you can do is just advocacy. If there is a Black museum in your neighborhood that you love, which you should love because they do amazing work, you can write as a tax-paying person, you can write to Congress, you can write to your local representatives and just let them know how much that museum means to you, and it will change the trajectory of that museum. I have seen it where the state historic preservation offices will say, we need to have a line item for these museums to make sure that, they're sustained. So just, if you can't go, the other thing to do is just advocacy. Write a quick letter. It could be, scribble scrabble, as my son calls it, but I call it cursive. But just sending something to somebody who's empowered to let them know that this information and this museum is important.
I think that is an essential one that you added. Thank you for tossing that in there as well. So we've now reached the question and answer portion of our discussion. So I'll be reading a few and allowing our panelists to hear from the folks who are online with us. So the first one we have asks, does the International African American Museum in Charleston offer DNA testing or other testing, this person seems to be hoping to do a family tree or a genealogy research. Can anyone speak to that, or any other museums that might offer any type of DNA testing?
Yeah, I mean, I can because I was there, but I don't think the DNA testing is part of it, but they do have a genealogy center, which was one of the things that was most attractive to both myself and my daughter. She was very engaged when she went in there. They have kiosks set up where you can use resources that they suggest to help build your family tree. The other thing that they're doing, it's not happening right now, but because 40 to 45% of African Americans or Africans came through the port of Charleston, we believe that 90% of African Americans have some link to South Carolina. Before we had gone, I recently learned that my great-great-grandmother was born in South Carolina. That's something I didn't know before. And so I think just having, when they're able to get the resources from the state corralled so that they can provide that type of information, I think it will be invaluable for many African Americans to trace their genealogy, especially when we get to that, what they call it, the wall of 1870, where you can't figure out who, what, when, or why because there's only a first name, and they have the type of information in that state that will help us to get past that. So I think that will be a resource, but I do not know that they do any on-site DNA testing or anything like that.
Right now, I don't think any of our museums do on-site DNA testing. There are genealogy centers throughout our museums. I know that the National Museum of African American History and Culture does a digitation curation for families. So that's a really cool thing. And it's like a center. But also AAAM just went into a partnership with African Ancestry. So we have a code that, I'll make sure to give to the team so that you can purchase it. And they're the only DNA specialists that destroy your DNA after they let you know where you're from. So I just got mine done, and I found out I'm part of the Booby tribe. That's part of an island that's off of Africa, and it was really cool. But at the same time, I'm like, now I need to go. Now I need to find all my Booby people and figure out where they are. So I'll make sure that you guys have that, and we'll also be on social media at Black Museums for everything that we have.
Another one of our attendees is asking, how do we engage in a generation that is consumed with digital and virtual experiences? How do we keep them engaged with learning about Black history and our culture?
One of the things that I've learned taking groups and groups of school kids through the museum is just how dependent and directed by technology people are nowadays, and you have to be. I am not a technological person. Probably you can tell by how hard it is for me to connect to this event. But one of the things that I like to do, or one of the things that I've learned to do, is to talk a little bit about the difference between an actual thing and a thing that you receive through a device. There's a difference between the world around you and the world mediated by this technology. You don't need that device to interpret reality for you, but it is an ongoing process of saying, it's cool, and devices are great and wonderful, and it gives you access to all sorts of information and images, but you're actually in the place where the thing exists. So take the time to understand it, experience it in this way. And then once you leave, and you don't have access to it anymore, then you can experience it through your device. But right now, put your device away and actually interact with this sculpture, this painting, this artifact. Touch it. Sometimes you can actually touch things. and experienced them personally. So it's an ongoing struggle. I'm old fashioned, so I struggle with it. But yeah, it's just an ongoing thing that you just have to deal with on a daily basis.
I think the way that we don't necessarily monitor any of that, but we do not allow photos inside of the exhibit space. And because of that, a lot of people don't have their phones out. What I do notice is that once children get inside or once students get inside, they become consumed by the story. So maybe the idea is just to kind of detach them from that, or once they get inside of a space and they begin to become consumed with it and reading into it and having people with them to explain it. I notice that kids who come in and they have someone talking them through what happened, they're a little more intrigued by the story. So when they come out and we ask them, what did you take from it? They picked up something. They may not have gotten the whole gist of it, but they get something from it. So as long as they're coming in with a blank slate and they leave out with something, that's something that I would be proud of. Just knowing that that little bit has impacted them just enough to where they've picked up something and they can pass it along to the next person they meet. So I'm not concerned about them taking the whole piece. Just a little bit is good enough for me.
Yeah, I think Jessica makes a really good point in that I felt like there were moments where I could tell Layla was more engaged and less engaged. And it was often when, if there was something very text heavy, that's when she was like, she was zoning out. But as soon as we got to things that were maybe more interactive, then she would experience it in a different way. Part of it also, though, is when I would insert myself into it and say, oh, look at this story. And like Jessica said, talk her through it. Then she would be engaged in it as well. So I think it's just finding a way, whether it's through technology or through, some sort of verbal conversation to connect with younger people. Because, for the most part, I think, museums are for adults. Kids can't go in by themselves necessarily. So they really are geared to us. And helping them find ways to access it is our responsibility.
Our next question gets us back into that education topic. One attendee says, any suggestions for classroom teachers in Georgia feeling restrained by new rules and mandates?
I would say as you're feeling restricted, and not being able to work through your topics as freely. I would just say, connect to a local museum or connect to a museum period, because there'll be supplemental information there. Now I don't want you to get fired, so I'm going to give that to Jeff to answer, because he might be able to, help you through that a little bit more. But what I've learned with my friends and family who are teachers and administrators, they give supplemental readings and supplemental projects for individuals, for the students to kind of connect to, like who do you connect with a little bit more in Black history, like who is your person. And then they kind of like just switch it a little bit more and say, well, look for at least 3 other individuals who are just like that you didn't know before, and then kind of like bridge the gap. I've seen those types of creative things on a national level. But Jeff, take it away, because I want everybody to keep their jobs. I don't want them to say Vedette told me this and I'm running with it.
I would obviously connected to Bibb County Public School District. Obviously, we are a kind of an adjunct to that, an alternative educational institution. So we take, educating people about African American art, history, and culture seriously, and we work hand in hand with, schools, whether they're grade schools or high schools or local colleges, what have you. I feel for all of those people out there who are dealing with restrictions and dealing with pressures. But in general, we don't have those limitations here. So this institution or institutions like this could be a really great aid to whatever you're doing in your class.
And we have come to the end of our program, but Nedra, I want you to know that people are more curious about Layla's experiences. They want to know more about her journey. You could even share the road trip playlist that y'all had throughout this week-long trip. But thank you so much for joining us. Are there any final thoughts very quickly before we wrap up?
I would like to say, I think Jeff cut off, but I think what he was trying to say is that museums don't have the restrictions that classrooms have. So if you want to give them an authentic experience when it comes to Black history, or to teach them about Black history, you can bring your students to a museum and they won't have those restrictions, and they'll at least have a lesson on that topic.
My last thoughts are, I had about 10 readers reach out to me saying, what a great idea, we're going to do this too, on social media and via email. So I would just offer to everyone that, yes, this is a great thing to do. You don't have to do 5 museums, that might have been a lot, but maybe 2, or even just 1, maybe 1 every year. But just taking the opportunity to see these places and to experience these presentations of Black history in the different ways that every museum does it.
Well, thank you so much to the panelists. This has been a great conversation. I hope everybody has learned something new, and I hope everybody feels inspired to go visit some Black history museums. I know that I do. There's a long list that I need to start crossing off. If you want to learn more about Unapologetically ATL or future events or coverage that we're working on, feel free to subscribe to our weekly newsletter. You can subscribe at www.ajc.com/UATL. Thank you again for joining us, and see you next time.